everyone. Welcome to the third Living Room Lecture Series. My name is Hannah Zimmerman, and I'm the Marketing and Communications Director at Historic Locust Grove. We're joined today by Ronnie Dreistadt of the Kentucky Derby Museum. Thank you so much for being with us, Ronnie.
Thank you.
We're so excited to have all of you join us in a virtual space. Just a few housekeeping notes. We are going to be using the chat for any questions and comments you have during the lecture. We're currently having a very vigorous commentary about favorite Kentucky derbies. We also are going to ask everyone to keep their video and microphones turned off during the meeting. This makes for a better viewing experience for everyone. And we will also be making a recording of this video so you can rewatch it as much as possible. I know we're all big Ronnie fans here, so we'll want to rewatch that as much as possible. But I'm going to turn it over briefly to our Locust Grove Executive Director, Dr. Carol Ely. Carol would like to say a few words. Hi, Carol.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
There, got it. Okay. Welcome. Hannah had asked the question, where are you calling from? And I'm in my living room at home in Louisville, but just wanted to point out that the paint color behind me, this gold, is inspired by the yellow room at Locust Grove. When we started painting Locust Grove in bright colors, I looked around at my pale pastel walls and said, this is boring. And so I was inspired. The room next to me is actually a kind of an intense blue purple. So yeah, you can learn from history, right? But I want to thank Hannah and the staff of Locust Grove for continuing to put out such great experiences, great content for people during this strange time we're all living through. And in fact, it's an interesting challenge to take something that's supposed to be a hands-on experiential kind of thing and figure out a way to deliver it virtually, but we're all learning and there are ways. So we're going to continue to put out virtual content, because even when we're able to reopen, which we hope will be not too far into the summer, but we don't have a date yet, we will still continue to put out virtual content, because I know a lot of people will be limited in their ability to leave the house. So we will continue to deliver on our mission through any means necessary. And we also thank the people who have been speakers in this Living Room Lecture Series, taking their own time to help put history out for you. And we're also grateful to you for staying with us through all of this. And you're still welcome to enjoy our grounds, which are lovely. The meadow is actually looking a little bit like a meadow, and the gardens are fantastic. Our gardener Sarah has been there, and since we're not driving trucks on the grounds to have big events, you know, we missed the gardeners fair that would have been coming up. But the grounds are in pristine condition, so you are welcome, using, of course, correct social distancing, to walk the grounds. So. With no further ado, let's hear from, I think Hannah is going to introduce our speaker. So thank you.
I am going to introduce our speaker, but the very first thing we're going to do in your Kentucky Derby experience is always a mint julep. So I'm going to flip it over to Brian Cushing, who is our program director at Locust Grove. And Brian is going to show us how to make a mint julep. Brian, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We sure can. All right, take it away, Brian.
All right. So we can't have a derby event without a mint julep. And also, if you've been hanging in with our historic mint julep series, it took a while for bourbon really to become an accepted way to make a mint julep. But this is if not the first, one of the earliest documented examples of bourbon being used as the basis for a mint julep, and it came from the Kentuckian Henry Clay's journal. They called him the Great Compromiser, and in the 1840s, he wrote down in his journal his method for making a mint julep, which did include bourbon and was not usual for that day. So what we're going to do, the ingredients that we're going to need, we do need some bourbon, of course. My favorite bourbon for a mint julep is the Old Bardstown Bottled and Bond 100 proof. You can use whatever bourbon is your favorite. I can tell you from tending Locust Grove bars that Locust Grove's audience is a Woodford audience, another great choice. Chris Morris over there has been great to us. Brown Farm Corporation, really great to Locust Grove. You'll need some sprigs of mint, some sugar, some chilled water. Now, this is one case where if you substitute simple syrup, you're not going to get the full effect. You really do need to have sugar and chilled water for this. Henry Clay called for a coin silver goblet to mix this in. And I searched for one. I found a coin silver goblet of the period on eBay. It was very cost prohibitive. So we're going to be going with a common silver plate julep cup. It's going to get the same job done. And of course, you'll need some finely crushed ice. The procedure for this one is very easy, and I'll be honest, I was skeptical when I read it, but it's just phenomenal. The first thing you're going to need to do is to relieve one of those mint stalks of their leaves. Take those leaves, place them inside the cup, and just kind of bruise them around a little bit. Kind of get that oil off into your cup. Doesn't have to take too long, but you'll start to smell the smell of the mint, the scent of the mint kind of wafting up at you. And then Mr. Clay has us discarding those leaves. He has you filling your goblet, or in this case, a cup half full with the fine cracked ice. I've been going about 3/4 actually, because you're going to get some meltiness in there. It's been working pretty well. Okay, the next thing he calls for is a jigger of bourbon. We're going to call a jigger 2 ounces. If you don't have anything to measure ounces in at home, that's 4 tablespoons. I like these little jelly jars that have the ounces on the side. You'll see me using fancier equipment at the bar at Locust Grove, but there's 2 ounces of our bourbon. Just simply pour that over the ice. Don't even bother mixing it. The next thing is we're going to take in another vessel, we're just going to use this little tumbler here, a teaspoon of our sugar and some chilled water. And you can eyeball this, just give it about enough to get good and mixed in. And now the first thing, if you know about mixing sugar, you're gonna notice that this is not going to dissolve very well. And that's true, and that's part of the key here. I was surprised, I was a little skeptical. So you'll start to see the moisture gather on the side of your julep cup. Get this moving really good. Don't worry about it dissolving too much, because it's not going to. And before it has a chance to separate, just pour that over the rest of the mixture. Get you a couple of sprigs of your mint. Rub them in your hands. It's going to start to release the scent. Plant those in your julep cup. Put a straw in there. In those days, they might use a reed. One thing I like to do is to snip the straw off very close to the mint, because the scent of the mint is where you're going to pick a lot of that flavor up off of. And there you have Mr. Henry Clay's mint julep from his journal in the 1840s. And there's just something about the way that those not quite combined ingredients drip down and filter through that ice. You pick up a little bit of everything, and this is just a very satisfying mint julep. So however you make it, I hope you enjoy it, and welcome back to the Living Room Lecture Series. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you so much, Brian. I'm so pleased that we're all able to gather in this way. I'm going to put Ronnie in the spotlight now. Ronnie, I think you're unmuted. And now it's the moment we've all been waiting for. They're all in line, ready to start. Ronnie, are you ready for me to introduce you officially?
I'm ready.
Okay, just a quick reminder, everyone, please use the chat to ask questions. And if you have any technical questions, you can go ahead and ask in the chat or through email. Also, if you need a minute to go and get a mint julep, we certainly understand. So let me go ahead and introduce our speaker today, Ronnie Dreistadt, who is currently the Manager of Education Services at the Kentucky Derby Museum. After giving tours for one summer in 1995, he turned a summer job into a career that is now in its 25th year, with a few pit stops along the way. He has served as Assistant Supervisor of Visitor Services, Outreach Educator, and his current position of Manager of Education Services directing the museum education efforts both in-house and throughout the Commonwealth through the outreach program of the Derby Museum. Ronnie earned his Bachelor of Arts in American History from Indiana University Southeast and a Master of Arts in Education from Spalding University. Ronnie resides in Southern Indiana with his fiance, who I believe is with us today, and his 3 children, Jacqueline, Caleb, and Mary Kate. Ronnie, take it away.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I so happy to be here today with you virtually. Normally at the Derby Museum this time of year, we are swamped with school children. Actually, normally this week we would be cleaning up from the Kentucky Derby and getting ready for the rest of our field trips that we have in May. But hey, this is the next best thing, right? We can do this virtually, and this program in particular, Louisville and its Derby, is my most popular education program, I'd say, for grades 4 through 8 or so. And what we've done with the children's program is kind of amped it up for you guys. So it's an adult program. I don't typically talk about mint juleps to school children, you know, when they visit. So we're going to go through a lot of history, and we'll have some time for questions at the end. If you have your mint julep, take a sip, and here we go. And we're going to go ahead and start with someone that the Locust Grove people know and love, and that'd be George Rogers Clark, right? And we're going to be talking about kind of how Louisville and the Derby grew up together, and what better way to start than George Rogers Clark and his journey down the Ohio River. With about 175 men during the Revolutionary War, Clark and those guys made it to the Falls of the Ohio in 1778. And in 1778, they couldn't get past the falls very well because it was the only natural obstruction in the waterway. And so they built a blockade or a fort on an island in the river. And that, I don't know if you can see my arrow there, but that's Corn Island. And Corn Island is not there anymore. It's been washed away for the most part, and there may be a little bit of it under the shoreline. But Corn Island is where they drilled to get ready for the British, and they were there for about a month. And the reason why they built it on Corn Island, there were 2 reasons. Number one, for safety, in case the Native Americans attacked them. But also, they didn't want anybody deserting. And so it would have been a whole lot harder to desert if you had to cross the river. So they drilled there, and finally they surprised the British. And first they hit Kaskaskia, which is in western Illinois. They hit Cahokia. And then they had to backtrack a little bit and attack Fort Sackville at Vincennes. And that's the one that I learned about in 4th grade, you know, where they marched through the cold water and completely surprised the British at Vincennes. And George Rogers Clark was forever known after that as the conqueror of the Old Northwest. I mean, if you're going to have a title, something like that, right? It has a good ring to it, the conqueror of the Old Northwest. So George Rogers Clark came back to the area basically a hero. He was very well respected. But he also ran into some issues with debt and problems like that. We'll get into more of that in a second. But upon returning, they built a new fort. And this time they built it on the mainland, on the Kentucky side of the river, Fort Nelson. And the community that grew up around that fort, they named it Louisville. So there it is, guys. There's the start of our city right there. Some of you may have been to the little park they have just a couple of blocks from the Yum Center. Where Fort Nelson was located. And there were other communities as well. Shippingport developed on a peninsula on the river just west of this fort. There was Portland, another small community. And then across the river, you had Jeffersonville and later on New Albany. General Clark moved across the river to a place later called Clark's Point. And the community that grew up around that area he named Clarksville. So you know, he had a nice view of the falls right there, and lived there for about 9 years. But really these weren't, I would say, happy times for General Clark. Again, he struggled with debt. Unfortunately, he was paid in land instead of, cold hard cash. And he was land poor. He didn't really have the means to develop the land. So again, he lived there for about 9 years, was involved in several different things, but eventually moved back to Louisville after he had an accident and fell into a fireplace and had to have a leg amputated. And he spent the last years of his life with the Cron family at Locust Grove. And I'll throw a plug in there. If you haven't been to Locust Grove lately, take advantage of it. They've just done such an amazing job with restoration and also interpreting all of the amazing people that lived on the site. But you all know George Rogers Clark was not the only important Clark in our story, right? He had several younger brothers, and one of his younger brothers was William Clark, and he was the Clark in the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Of course, we learned in school that William Clark and Meriwether Lewis crossed the Louisiana Purchase, and they made it all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Something you got to remember, though, once you get to the ocean, you're only halfway, right? They had to come all the way back. And but what the Corps of Discovery did was they made a lot of scientific discoveries. They made a lot of geographic discoveries. And William Clark settled in St. Louis, Missouri. He was the Native American commissioner there, a very respected person in the community. And William Clark had a family. So let's go ahead and meet his oldest son. Now, normally, if we were doing this at the Derby Museum, we would have volunteers come up, kids, and I'd dress them up like the Clark family, but we won't do that now. So let's meet his oldest son. This is Meriwether Lewis Clark Sr., and that's him in the middle, and he was an architect. He was also a military guy, and what I want to do is kind of show you now how the Clark family and the Churchill family, Churchill Downs, how they sort of intersected. Okay, because you can see in the picture, Clark Sr. had a lot of kids, all boys. And unfortunately, just before this picture was made, the mother, her name was Abigail, she passed away. And she left Meriwether there with all those boys to take care of. And you can see one of them's having a really hard time with the camera. They've got his head on there pretty good, looking, look ahead, kid. But I want you to pay attention to this one here. This is Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr. After his mother passed away, Clark Jr., or they called him Ludi, he was sent to Louisville to live with some relatives, and their last name was Churchill. So who are the Churchills? The Churchills were a little bit like the Clarks. They were from Virginia. They were landowners, but they came west because they were seeking other opportunities. The first Churchill in the region, his name was Armistead Churchill. You can see he came to Kentucky between 1784 and 1788. When he got here, he was not impressed. The community that had grown up around Fort Nelson, he thought was a little backwards, and he even told people if the river ran the other way, he'd have just gone back home. But luckily, the river went west, and Armistead Churchill stayed and had a family, and his youngest son was named Samuel. Samuel married into a prominent family. Her name was Abigail Oldham, next door neighbor, Oldham County. And they built a house called Spring Grove. Spring Grove in the picture there was built right off of Eastern Parkway. And it was there until about in the 1960s before it was torn down. But they had 16 kids in that house together. And the fourth daughter, her name was Abigail, Abby. So Abigail Churchill, she married Meriwether Lewis Clark Sr., there in the picture, and they had those boys. But like I said, Abigail died soon after the boys were born, and Ludi was sent to live at Spring Grove, there in the picture. And what did Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr. do? This little kid right here? Well, he grew up and he started a horse race called the Kentucky Derby. So if you've got your julep, go ahead and toast the Churchills and the Clarks. Very, very instrumental in the history of our region. In the meantime, Louisville's growing, and it grew quicker than most of the other area settlements because of its location at the falls. River traffic was really growing during this time period. And but when they got to the falls, they had to stop. And what they would do is they would unload everything off the boats, and they would put them on wagons, and they would go around the falls, and then there would be boats waiting on the other side. So naturally, when people stopped, they were liable to spend money. So Louisville was a great place to start a business, and it grew very quickly. And in this picture here, you can see Beargrass Creek. It used to go into the river much closer to downtown than it does today. But horses were also extremely important in that time period, and mainly to work. When you talk to kids about horses today, they think of them as pets, or maybe even jumpers, or maybe race horses. They don't typically think of horses as work animals. But back in those days, horses were essential in farming and transportation, and there really wasn't a whole lot of leisure time to race horses. But in the late 1600s, early 1700s, a new type of horse is being bred in Great Britain, and they were bred to race, and they were called thoroughbreds. And the first thoroughbred came across the Atlantic Ocean in 1730. He ended up in the colony of Virginia, and his name was Bull Rock. And it wasn't soon after that that thoroughbreds began crossing the Appalachians into what would later become Kentucky. And you know, they didn't understand the science behind it, but they understood that thoroughbreds in Kentucky were stronger and more durable than horses from other regions. And the thoroughbred industry in Kentucky really got going in the 1820s and on into the 1830s. And these thoroughbred farms spread out, even into the area that Louisville is today. Like this farm right here was called the Bray Place. It was located right off of the Bardstown Pike, or Bardstown Road today. And the Bray Place, that house there dates nearly back to as old as Locust Grove, if not older. 1792 is when this was built. The Bray Place eventually did breed a Derby winner. His name was Lookout, 1893 Derby winner. And then across the street was an even larger farm, and this one was called Bashford Manor. Many of the people in the audience may be nodding their head right now, like, wait a minute, I went to the mall there, right? Or you know, Walmart today. But Bashford Manor was one of the great early farms in Kentucky history. If you look carefully at the picture, can you find the swimming pool? They had one. It's that little dark circle sort of in the middle. That was a swimming pool made out of creek rock. And you can see there was a little wooden island in the middle of it. And eventually, there were 3 Kentucky Derby winners bred at Bashford Manor. The house, the big Second Empire mansion, was torn down in the 1960s. The carriage house to the right stood until just about 10 or 15 years ago, when it was finally demolished as well. But Bashford Manor was located right off of where they built I-264, and so the land became very, very valuable, and it was eventually developed, like some of the old thoroughbred farms were. So where did they race these horses back in those days? Before Churchill Downs was built, there were several other racetracks in the community. The first racetrack was Market Street. It was the widest street in town. So naturally, they would use Market Street as a race course, which probably wasn't the most safe thing to do. Not pictured on this map was the old Elm Tree Garden track, and that was located on Shippingport, which was again a peninsula that went out into the river. And when they built the canal in 1830, it was turned into an island. At the Elm Tree Garden track, they had a jockey, a 14-year-old jockey who showed some potential, but unfortunately this jockey kept growing and growing until he was 7 foot 8 inches tall. That's Jim Porter. And Jim Porter really turned out to be one of our first celebrities. And Charles Dickens, the Charles Dickens, came to Louisville and wanted to visit with Jim Porter, who owned a tavern in Portland. Another racetrack that has some interesting history to it was the Woodlawn Racecourse. That was opened just before the years of the Civil War. It did not survive the Civil War, I don't believe, but is forever known for its trophy. They gave a beautiful, beautiful gold vase to a horse in 1861. And legend has it that during the Civil War, this beautiful trophy was buried on the grounds. But today we know it as the Woodlawn vase, and it is the trophy that they give the Preakness winner. And that's a tradition that goes back into the early 20th century. Probably the first real organized racetrack in Louisville, the one that was run by a jockey club, would have been Oakland. You see it over there just under Jim Porter. And Oakland was a very genteel place. This is where guys like Henry Clay and Robert Aitchison Alexander would have brought horses to run. And Oakland was in what is old Louisville today. And it was the site of one of the great intersectional rivalries in the 1830s. In 1839, there was a horse named Wagner, and Wagner was a Virginia-bred animal, and he was sort of the champion of the East. And Kentucky was bragging about their horse named Gray Eagle, who was a 5-year-old horse by this time. And they finally met up at the Oakland racetrack. On September 30th, 1839, those two horses raced in a series of match races. And what it was best 2 out of 3, and the heats were 4 miles. So these were incredible tests of stamina. Wagner won the first 2 races, and so there was no need for a third race. And a couple weeks later, there was a rematch, and Wagner won again, completing his dominance of Great Eagle. But a lot of people credited the jockey aboard Wagner, and his name was Cato. And that's him in the picture right there. Cato was an enslaved African American. And most of the big jockeys, the most well-known jockeys of the day, were enslaved African Americans. In fact, after Cato won that second race, he was able to keep some of the money that was won, and he actually bought his own freedom. And really the first sports stars in America were jockeys like Cato. There was another one in Tennessee. His name was Simon. Simon was involved in a series of match races against some of Andrew Jackson's horses, and great stories out of those. There was a gentleman out east named Austin Curtis, who was another enslaved jockey. And it was really these jockeys who were the first real American sports heroes. I always tell kids, if they would have had ESPN back in those days, these jockeys would have been highlighted every day. But let's not forget that they were also enslaved. It was a strange, real dichotomy in American history. Louisville's continuing to grow. And I mentioned earlier that the Louisville and Portland Canal was built, and you can see it took shipping port right off of the mainland and made it an island. Soon after that, shipping port as a town began to die away. They had their own erosion problems as well, and it eventually died away. And when the canal was finished, it really it made river traffic much more manageable, and river traffic continued to grow and grow. And the Louisville and Portland Canal was originally pretty, you can see it was pretty narrow. And of course, they still use this canal today, but it's much, much wider because of the barge traffic. You go on through the 1840s and 1850s, and the institution of slavery continues to be a thorn in the side of American history. And Louisville became a very, very important part of the Underground Railroad. Now, when I first started learning about this, I thought, well, sure, the Falls of the Ohio, right? It's shallow. Enslaved people would be able to cross much easier at the falls. Well, everybody else knew that too. So it was very, very difficult to cross at the Falls of the Ohio if you were heading north. Most of the crossings, from what we can tell, took place closer to where the Sherman-Minton Bridge is today. And you can see these are some Underground Railroad routes here. And I always remind kids, these aren't real railroads. These are networks of people who are trying to help other people escape slavery. And if you'll notice, I put a little purple circle around Louisville there. And if you'll notice that little red line, that was a main Underground Railroad route there that went where I mentioned, just around where the Sherman-Minton Bridge is today, and into the town of New Albany. And New Albany had a church called the Second Presbyterian Church, and it stands on Main Street. The Ohio River is right behind this church, and we don't know how many people were able to escape because of the people in this church, but we do know that it was significant. There's the basement of the church there. Slaves could get into the basement of the church, and there was a tunnel through this door that went underneath of Main Street, and across the street there was a hotel, and behind the hotel were railroad tracks, and the railroad went north. And again, we're not sure of how many people were able to escape, but it certainly was significant leading up to the years of the Civil War. Okay, everybody, what side was Kentucky on during the Civil War? Well, some of you guys might be thinking north, some of you might be thinking south, but I always tell the kids, we were kind of for whoever was going to win. That's who we were going to go put our lot in. But Kentucky was neutral. Kentucky was neutral, but we did have resources that both armies really wanted and really needed. And in fact, the Confederate Army did threaten Louisville in September of 1862, and the order was given to evacuate. The Confederate Army decided not to come this way. We were pretty heavily guarded, and the evacuation was soon lifted. But Abraham Lincoln, the Kentuckian himself, who was the president of the North, he very famously said, "I want to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky." And why did he say that? Well, the Ohio River and the Mississippi River both borders our state. But something you also have to remember is that we had horses. Kentucky had those thoroughbred horse farms, and both armies sent detachments into our state to raid those farms. And when the war was over, they didn't bring the horses back. And it looked like that the Civil War was going to completely destroy the thoroughbred industry in Kentucky. And I know some of you are thinking, okay, what in the world does this have to do with the Derby, right? Well, here's your link right here. Remember him? Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr., remember the young man that grew up with his uncles, the Churchills? Well, after the Civil War, he decided he wanted to do something to try to get people breeding thoroughbreds again. Well, what better way to do that than to have a big race? The trouble with Clark was he didn't really know that much about horse racing. So he was sent to Europe, where they had a lot of traditions with horse racing. And while in Europe, Clark saw a race called the Epsom Derby. Everybody say it at home, Derby, right? We say Derby, but you know, that's how we are. But anyway, the Epsom Derby, Clark witnessed it, and he was very impressed. The Epsom Derby had been run since the 1700s, and it was a race just for thoroughbreds. The distance was 1.5 miles, and it was limited to 3-year-olds, horses that were just reaching maturity. So Clark was very impressed by this, and he said basically, well, if they can do this in England, we can try this back in Kentucky. So he traveled back to Louisville, and he started a group called the Louisville Jockey Club. And the Louisville Jockey Club built a grandstand and clubhouse. I'll show you that in a second. But on May 17th, it was a Monday afternoon, 1875, we are now ready to run this Derby for the first time. The question is anybody going to show up to watch it? Well, the newspaper, they got excited. The Courier-Journal newspaper got real excited. They wanted to promote the Derby. At one point, they said, "Hey, St. Louis, you have your fair. Hey, New Orleans, you have your Mardi Gras. Hey, we're Louisville, and we have the Derby." And they said that even before they'd ever run the race. So they were pretty excited. The first line of the newspaper headline, I love it. It says, "Today will be historic in Kentucky annals as the first Derby day of what promises to be a long series of annual turf festivities, which we confidently expect our grandchildren 100 years hence to celebrate in glorious centennial rejoicings." I love how they used to write back in those days, you know, all the flowery words and everything. But they were excited. They were excited about that first Derby. And it turned out to be a beautiful sunny day. About 10,000 people showed up. And they even watered the streets. This was a big event. They watered the streets to keep the dust down. And there it is, the Louisville Jockey Club, the first version of Churchill Downs. So the grandstand was located on the opposite side of where it is located today. But you can see it was a beautiful Victorian structure. But if you were a friend of Colonel Clark's and you were a member of the Jockey Club, you see the little cottage on the end, that was the clubhouse. And this is what I call Millionaire's Row, 1875 style. And again, 10,000 people showed up to the first Derby. It was a huge success. And they watched a horse named Dreistadt win the race. He set the North American distance record. So that shows you right there, they were getting really good horses for the first Derby. And Dreistadt was ridden by an African-American jockey named Oliver Lewis. Again, we're not talking about slave jockeys anymore. Emancipation Proclamation, slavery has been outlawed, but African-Americans still continue to dominate the jockey ranks. In fact, of the 15 jockeys in the first Derby, 13 of them were black jockeys. 15 of the first 28 Derby winners were ridden by black jockeys, and here are two of the best. Isaac Murphy on your left, many would consider him to be the greatest jockey ever. He won the race 3 times, 3 Derby winners for Isaac Murphy, and he won nearly 44% of all races he ever run in, and just an amazing record. The last black jockey to win the Derby was in 1902. That was Jimmy Winkfield. In fact, he won the Derby in 1901 and 1902, back to back. He ran second in 1903 and then never ran in another Derby again. Well, how'd that happen? Segregation is how it happened. The Jim Crow era is pushing segregation, and Jimmy Winkfield was basically pushed out of the sport. Black jockeys were no longer getting the same opportunities, and so Winkfield decided he was going to go somewhere where he would have opportunities, and that was Europe. And he spent the rest of his professional career in Europe, and he actually became a very wealthy man as a jockey in Europe. Let's continue on a little bit here, everybody. 1880s was a good time at the racetrack. You had a lot of those great black jockeys winning a lot of races. You had Hindu. He was like the secretariat of the 1880s, just a dominating racehorse. Spokane has an interesting story. I'll tell you his little story in just a second. But the Derby's really doing well. It's taken off. The only problem is they're not making any money. Even though the Derby's becoming well known, Colonel Clark had a really hard time balancing the ledger sheet. And they're just not making any money. And then there's also other things happening in town as well that's, you know, a little competition to horse racing. Professional baseball was a big part of our early history. In fact, the National League was formed in 1876, and Louisville had a team in the original National League. We had a pro sports team. Unfortunately, the next year in 1877, several of those players there on your left were caught gambling on baseball games. And if you don't think that's serious, ask Pete Rose. It was a big deal. And the team folded. They were called the Louisville Grays, and the team folded soon after. They made another attempt. You see the other picture there. That's the Louisville Eclipse, later the Colonels. And they were a powerful team for a while. In fact, we had the biggest slugger of the day, and his name was Pete Browning. Pete Browning, I think one year he led the National League in home runs. He hit 3, right? It was the dead ball era. But Pete Browning, he was one of the most fearsome sluggers of the day. And speaking of sluggers, this is where we make them, right? Hillerk and Bradsby in 1892 began making baseball bats. And of course, Louisville, Kentucky, still known for their Louisville Sluggers. Maybe you didn't want baseball. Maybe you wanted instead to go to the fair. And we had a Southern Exposition that was almost like a World's Fair. It was only supposed to last 1 year, I believe, 100 days in 1883, but it was so popular that it ran until 1887. And they boasted the largest wooden building in the world. supposedly. And that's where you could come and see brand new inventions, a lot of different farming equipment to, to make life easier. Thomas Edison even came to this, and he brought his incandescent light bulbs, and people would come and they even watched Chester Arthur, the President of the United States, come and open up the Southern Exposition. The Southern Exposition ended in 1887. The wooden building was torn down, and it became one of the most prominent suburbs of Louisville of that day. And today we call it Old Louisville. And Old Louisville, either the first or second largest Victorian neighborhood in the country, and a source of pride for all Louisvillians. Okay, I mentioned Spokane, right? The 1889 Kentucky Derby winner. This guy here, Frank James, was a big Spokane supporter. Now, if you don't know who Frank James was, it was a big deal when he showed up to the 1889 Derby. And the reason why, mainly because of his younger brother, Jesse James. And they always said that Frank taught Jesse everything they needed to know about robbing banks. Well, by the time Frank James came to the Derby in 1889, he was a reformed outlaw. But still, people were kind of a little bit leery hanging around these rough guys at the racetrack. And when Spokane won the Kentucky Derby in 1889, it was found out that Frank James had bet $5,000 on Spokane to win. Now, that's a lot of money today. It was a whole ton of money back then. And it was a very controversial Derby because Spokane and a horse named Proctor Knott hit the finish line together. It looked like a tie, but of course, no photo finish back in those days. And after about an 18 or 19 minute delay, the judges decided that, hey, Spokane won the Derby by a nose. And a lot of people walked out of Churchill thinking, yeah, they didn't want Frank James shooting up the town. That's why they gave it to Spokane. But one kind of a legend of that time period. And the Derby is starting to get a little bit of a different reputation now. It's getting a little bit of a different reputation. The crowds are getting smaller. Again, the Jockey Club is having trouble making ends meet. In 1890, just a couple of weeks before the Derby, there was a horrible, horrible tragedy. A tornado ripped through town, killing well over 100 people. They did get things cleaned up in time. They ran the Derby on schedule, but the crowd was very, very small that year as we were still reeling from the effects of that tornado. It missed the racetrack by about 3/4 of a mile. But in 1891, we had a record holder show up. His name was Kingman. He was ridden by Isaac Murphy, the great black jockey. And unfortunately for Kingman, he holds a record that you don't really want. He ran the slowest Derby ever. And it took that poor horse almost 3 minutes to win the race. What happened was there were only 4 horses in the race, and Isaac Murphy, before the race, as he was getting ready to mount his horse, the trainer said, now, Ike, whatever you do, don't take an early lead. Let the other horses get out there and set a fast pace, and you come from behind and try to pass them in the end. So Isaac Murphy did exactly what he was told. They left the starting gate, or starting line. They didn't have gates back then. But he pulled back on his horse, and every trainer ended up having the same instructions. So nobody would take the lead. So finally, they're all just galloping around the track. They all hit the top of the stretch together. Kingman sprinted away. He proved to be the best sprinter that day, but the damage was done. It took almost 3 minutes to win, and Colonel Clark, the head of the Jockey Club, was not amused. The newspaper called it a funeral procession, and another newspaper called it a race for dogs. And they ran the Derby in 1892, but only 3 horses showed up for the 1892 Derby. And in 1894, Churchill Downs, the original Louisville Jockey Club, went bankrupt. And it looked like that Churchill may go the way as Oakland and Woodlawn and all of those other tracks in Louisville that didn't survive. Well, they did survive because a new group of people bought the property. And this will be on your test, everybody, so don't forget this name. It's a really difficult name to remember. They called themselves the New Louisville Jockey Club, and they made some changes. First of all, they built a new grandstand. This grandstand they adorned with 2 twin spires, which is, of course, today one of our great symbols of our city. And they also made some changes. They shortened the Derby down to 1.25 miles, and they still struggled a little bit, but then they hired a guy that we call Mr. Derby. He was a local tailor, and his name was Matt Wynne. And Matt Wynne took over in the early 20th century, and by the time he died in 1948, he had turned the Derby into really what it is today. Much, much more than a horse race, it became a cultural event and a big-time economic event for our region. How did he do it? Well, he understood the power of traditions. He said, "Hey, we're going to give the winner a big garland of roses." And Samuel Culbertson, who was on our board of directors and president of Churchill for a while, was a big part of that as well. And also in 1924, the Gold Cup was designed, the Kentucky Derby Gold Cup, and it is the only solid gold trophy given in North American sports. Matt Wynne said, "Hey, we need to sing my old Kentucky home. You know, we need to be proud of where we're from here." And it was Matt Wynne who said, "We got to get celebrities here. We don't want Frank James here. We want celebrities here." And that's Babe Ruth in the picture there, one of the greatest celebrities to ever attend the Derby. So the Derby's starting to turn around, but I will tell you, it was a 3-year-old girl who turned the Derby around maybe more than anybody, and her name was Regret. And Regret was the first filly, the first girl to come to Louisville to beat the boys. And she became a great symbol during the suffrage movement as women were fighting for the right to vote. Now, I passed over this guy, but if any of y'all like to gamble on horses, that's your horse there. That's Donerail. And in 1913, Donerail went off 91-1. Nobody thought he had a chance. In fact, his owner, trainer right there, that's T.P. Hayes, holding on to him. He didn't even want to put him in the Derby, but the jockey was named Roscoe Goose. He grew up, actually, he was from J-Town originally, and then lived in Louisville for a long time. He talked T.P. Hayes into putting him in the Derby and said, "Hey, if we just run 3rd or 4th, we'll make a little money that way, right?" Well, Donerail came flying down the stretch, and he won the Derby at 91-1, paid $184 on a $2 bet. And you see the guy behind Donerail with his head down, with his arms folded? He obviously did not bet Donerail. You know who else didn't bet him? T.P. Hayes, the owner. He didn't even bet on his own horse. So the lesson there, if any of y'all are ever lucky enough to get a horse in the Derby, at least put $2 on him. You never know what's going to happen in a horse race. Let's go to Sir Barton. There's our first Triple Crown winner, 1919. That horse had never won a race in his life until he got to the Churchill Downs and he won the Derby. The Preakness was only 4 days later. He won the Preakness in Baltimore. Then he won another race called the Withers, and then he won the Belmont. So he is considered our first Triple Crown winner, even though that term didn't come into use until the 1930s. So as you can see, we were getting some really good horses here at Churchill Downs now, and things are starting to pick up. The traditions are starting to take hold, and yes, Churchill Downs is even starting to make a little money on these horse races. Technology is also starting to play a part in the Derby, and I did not include any video in this presentation because, to be honest with you, technology hates me, and the whole PowerPoint would explode probably if I tried to run video. But if you're interested, the 1918 Derby is our oldest Derby on film, and you can probably find it on YouTube. But technology and transportation, getting people to the races, and the crowds are really starting to now go over the 50 and 60,000 mark at Churchill Downs. A couple of young ladies who probably used those old streetcars back in those days were some celebrities, the Hill Sisters. And if you don't know who the Hill Sisters are, they were amazing songwriters. They were teachers, educators, and they wrote what is now the most well-known song in the whole world. And that would be Happy Birthday to You. And that song originated here in Louisville, Kentucky, and it's something we're very, very proud of here in our city. Churchill Downs is changing as well. Of course, the infield has always been the place to go if you don't have a ticket. back when they ran the first Derby, it was free. You could go to the infield for free and, you know, just run across the track in between races. They added tunnels in the 1930s, so you're not allowed to run across the track anymore. But it was also the site of the first airplane to ever take off from Kentucky. It was part of what was called the Great Aviation Meet. The Birdmen came to Churchill Downs, they said. The Kentucky State Fair was also held in the infield, and they had all kinds of crazy things happen. I apologize for the picture here. It's hard to look at, but one of the craziest events ever at Churchill Downs was they laid railroad track in the infield. They took 2 locomotive steam engines, put them opposite each other, and then crashed them into each other. And that was big time entertainment back in those days. And by the way, that drew 30,000 people to watch the stage demolition there. Louisville's a bustling place into the late 1920s, into the early 1930s, and you can still see that boats are still a very, very part of the transportation scene. In the background, you can see the railroad bridge connecting Louisville to southern Indiana. You can still see a few horses in the picture there for transportation. But of course, you can also see the horseless carriage. And the horseless carriage changed everything. Not right away, but after a while, with the improvement of the roads, the horseless carriage changed our way of life forever. And many people started to be, drive themselves to the Derby. The only problem was, once you got out of the races, it was a challenge to find your car. And look in the middle there. Can you imagine being parked in the middle? And it's going to have a good long time before you can get out of Churchill Downs. But the crowds are growing despite the Great Depression. Crowds are growing throughout Churchill Downs. And in fact, during the Depression, crowds even got larger because people needed an escape. Even though wagering was down, gambling was down, people loved to go to the track and watch those beautiful, beautiful thoroughbreds run. In 1933, they put on quite a show at Churchill Downs. There was a jockey named Herb Fisher who had never won the Derby before. He was on a horse named Headplay, and he thought, hey, this is my year. This is my year. I'm going to win the Derby. And he had a friend of his named Don Meade, and Don Meade was riding a horse named Broker's Tip, who had never won a race in his life. But coming down the straightaway, Headplay, that's him on the left right there, he had the lead, but Broker's Tip is starting to pass. And in desperation, Herb Fisher reaches out and grabs the saddle towel of the other horse. You're not supposed to do that. Don Meade retaliates, and they ended up tugging at each other for about the last 16th of a mile. And this is now forever known as the fighting finish. When the race was over, the judges declared Broker's Tip the winner, and it turned out to be the only race that horse ever won in his entire life, was the Kentucky Derby. But if you're going to win one, you might as well win the Derby, right? And as Don Meade was in the winner's circle celebrating, Herb Fisher was so upset that he tried to attack him in the winner's circle, and they were separated, and they went up to the jock's room, and that's where Herb Fisher took a boot jack and tried to beat Don Meade with a boot jack, and they had to be separated again. They were friends before the Derby, not so much afterwards. But there was one person, I guess, laughing all the way to the bank, you could say, and that was Matt Wynne, the president of Churchill Downs, because this picture was plastered on every newspaper in the country the next day. And hey, any attention is good attention, right? The terrible flood of 1937, just 4 years later, and yes, the floodwaters did reach Churchill Downs, but the waters receded in time, and the Derby was run on schedule on the first Saturday of May, 1937, and that's where War Admiral, the greatest son of man of war, showed up, and he was an eventual Triple Crown winner. His jockey was a local guy named Charlie Kurtzinger. They called him the Flying Dutchman. And the Flying Dutchman there was actually born right on the other side of the Churchill Downs racetrack, right off of Longfield Avenue. So it's always good to have a hometown guy, win the Kentucky Derby. And then the 1940s and 50s were dominated by Calumet Farm. In baseball, it was, the Yankees winning the World Series every year, but in horse racing, it was Calumet. absolutely dominating. They were the only farm to ever have 2 Triple Crown winners, Whirlaway and Citation. Citation, he was so good. He was in the middle of a 16-race winning streak, and he was so good, only 7 or 8 horses came to challenge him that day. And that's what happens when you know you're running for second place. Citation, he paid 40 cents on a $2 wager, one of our heaviest favorites to ever win. The community is starting to come together in the 1950s through what was called the Derby Festival. And the Pegasus Parade was one of the early Derby Festival events. And today, the Derby Festival is going to have an economic impact of around $128 million. So it's a wonderful thunder over Louisville and the parade and the steamboat races and all of these different things that bring our community together as we celebrate the upcoming Kentucky Derby. Television is also putting a big impact on the Derby. People were buying TVs in the 1950s, the old black and white televisions. And in 1953 was our highest rated Derby ever. Think about this. In 1953, they measured that about 72% of people that own televisions were tuned in to the Kentucky Derby. We'll never see that again. And one reason why was because we had a superstar on our hands, and his name was Native Dancer. And Native Dancer, a beautiful, beautiful gray horse. And one reason why he was so popular is he liked to fall way behind and then make a big mad dash at the end. And he looked like a white ghost on those old black and white televisions. Well, he got to the Kentucky Derby. He won 9 out of 9 races. He got into the Derby. He fell behind, made a big mad dash at the end, and came up about that short. He lost the Derby by that much, and Native Dancer never lost another race again. He won 21 out of 22, but he lost the big one. He lost the Kentucky Derby. But Native Dancer was our first big TV star as far as thoroughbreds go. You can tell he's a very photogenic, very beautiful horse, and was an absolute superstar. Speaking of superstars, how about this one? One of the most well-known people in the whole world, and Cassius Clay, later to be Muhammad Ali. I'll be honest with you, I was never a big boxing fan, and maybe I didn't understand the impact that Muhammad Ali had on this community until he passed away. When he passed away, I'll never forget the way the community again came together, and the funeral procession to Cave Hill Cemetery. I'll never forget it, how everything just kind of shut down and just people lined the streets watching the funeral procession as it passed. And of course, Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, was much more than a boxer. He was a community activist. He was a philanthropist. He was very involved in the civil rights movement. And this takes us up to 1967, during the height of the civil rights movement, as African Americans were fighting for freedom and for putting an end to the Jim Crow era. In April of 1967, the Board of Aldermen here in town denied a fair housing ordinance that would have ended a lot of the segregation. In response to that, in Louisville, there were marches, there were protests, and as the Derby began in 1967, Derby Week, many of the Derby Festival events were canceled because of the tensions and the escalations. Monday of Derby Week, they ran horse races at Churchill Downs, and several African-American youths ran onto the track during the first years. This is taken from the Courier Journal newspaper, and they disrupted the race and said, "We're not finished. We're going to be back on Saturday. We're going to be back on Derby Day, and we're going to try to shut this down." They wanted their voices to be heard, and believe it or not, this was not a novel thing. This actually happened in England in 1913 when a person in the suffrage movement jumped out onto the racetrack during the Epsom Derby and was trampled to death. So this was not unprecedented, but tensions continued to rise throughout the Derby week of 1967, and the Ku Klux Klan showed up. the Klan showed up and they marched outside of Churchill Downs, and they claimed they were going to save the Derby. Eventually, Martin Luther King came to Louisville to help calm people down. He met with Muhammad Ali. They met with community leaders and government leaders, and they decided they would march on Derby Day, but it would be held downtown. So the Derby ran on schedule in 1967, and then in December of that year, a new Board of Aldermen had been elected, and the fair housing ordinance passed by a wide margin. And I think we owe a lot of that success to Dr. King and Muhammad Ali coming together and kind of de-escalating things Derby week of 1967. Breaking down barriers was Diane Crump. In 1970, our first female jockey rode in the Kentucky Derby. We've had several lady jockeys since then, but we've not had a female jockey win the Derby as of yet. This is the 50th anniversary of Miss Crump and her breakthrough. And the Derby Museum, where I work, we are working on a new exhibit called Right to Ride. And you have to hear the stories these ladies tell as they fought for their right to ride. You know, civil rights, women's rights, these are still things that didn't just end when we say they ended. These are ongoing. And certainly the Kentucky Derby is a backdrop of all of those things. In the 1970s, you know, as Vietnam is raging and civil rights is still on the front page of the newspapers, you know, again, people need distractions sometimes. And what better distraction than a 1,200-pound absolute superstar? That's Big Red right there, Secretariat. And Secretariat came to Louisville, and he ran the fastest Kentucky Derby ever. It's a record he still holds at 1:59 and 2/5 seconds. And he became an absolute legend. He won the Preakness in record time. He made the cover of Time, Newsweek, Sports Illustrated. And then he went on to win the Belmont by an incredible 31 lengths. And that was a world record that he still holds to this day. Of course, now they have bobbleheads of him, postage stamps. And if you haven't seen it, enjoy the Disney movie of Secretariat, and where they tell the story of Big Red. And he was really the first in the 1970s of several great horses in the 70s. In 1977, Seattle Slew came to Churchill Downs. He was undefeated, and he was undefeated all the way through the Triple Crown races as well. The very next year, we have Affirmed. And you can't mention Affirmed without the great Alydar. And Affirmed beat him by, I think, what, a length and a half in the Derby. And then he beat him by a neck, I think, in the Preakness. And then it was just a scant nose in the Belmont. So Alydar pushed him every step of the way. But Affirmed always came out triumphant in the Triple Crown. And then the next year, what about this one here? Spectacular Bid, who won 26 out of 30. Would have probably won the Triple Crown, but the morning of the Belmont, he stepped on a safety pin, and it's kind of hard to run in a 1.5 mile race after you step on a safety pin. So these were some amazing, amazing animals that competed in the 1970s. Let's go back to baseball a second, just real quick, because in the 1980s, baseball was a big part of our community. The Louisville Redbirds were the first minor league team to ever draw 1 million people. And 1 million people, that's a lot of people to watch baseball in a season. And did you know that we outdrew 4 Major League Baseball teams that year as well? So the Redbirds played down at Cardinal Stadium, just down the street from Churchill Downs. And then in 2000, a new baseball stadium was built downtown. And it's hard to believe now that Cardinal Stadium, or that Slugger Field there is 20 years old. And this was really a movement. You know, this was really a movement of discovering our river heritage again, breaking those barriers. And Riverfront Park was a big part of that, a place where we always come together now for, you know, Waterfront Wednesdays and Thunder over Louisville and the 4th of July, and there's concerts and art shows and world expositions and things like that. Churchill Downs has changed a lot too. In 2003, they tore down part of that old part of the clubhouse there. Churchill added lights just a few years ago, so now we can enjoy night racing. Churchill added a video board, which has changed the landscape of the track now forever. And in fact, believe it or not, you can see the video board from Floyd's Knobs. I've been up in the Knobs and looked out over the hills, and you can barely see the Churchill video board from many, many miles away. Churchill today is the largest grandstand in North America for horse racing. And I've been at Churchill Downs since 1995, give or take a few years. And I think they've added on to the place every year that I've worked there. And it continues to grow, it continues to shine, and it continues to host the biggest crowds in the world for horse racing. Matt Wynne a long time ago said, hey, I want to get 200,000 people here, and maybe one of these days they might just do that. You know, Louisville's changed a lot too, from, you know, a small little outpost, Fort Nelson, to the metropolis that it is today. And there's no place I'd rather be from. Louisville, Kentucky, America's friendliest city, absolutely, right? But I do want to stop the program. I think I have one more slide after this. I do want to stop the program and mention that we do still build something in Louisville more so than any other town in the world. And we're still very proud of this. No, it's not baseball bats, disco balls. We still make more disco balls than any other city in the world, and I think that's something to be proud of as well. And let's go back to Meriwether Lewis for a second. You know, his goal was to make the Kentucky Derby the biggest horse race in the world. His goal was to bring the thoroughbred industry back. And so now we've had it at 145 years in a row. We'll run it again in September. That's the plan. But we've had 145 different thoroughbreds win the Derby. So before we get time for questions, my question to everybody out there is, how many of them do you think were born in Kentucky? How many of those 145 Derby winners were born in the Bluegrass State? And the answer to that is 111. And that's a big, big percentage. So if you still have your julep glass handy, I actually didn't want to drink anything before the program, but if you would, just raise your glass to Meriwether Lewis Clark Jr. right there, because he absolutely did what he set out to do. Through all the ups and downs, he made the Derby such an important part of the Louisville community. I want to thank you all for being here today, and I'll turn it over back to you, Hannah, and we'll have time for some questions and answers. And thank you all so much today.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Ronnie. I'm applauding on behalf of everyone joining us today. I also want to shout out to your coworker, I think Chamanthi,
Yeah.
knew how many horses were born in Kentucky. So well done there.
Good job.
Everyone, we're gonna just wait a minute to catch up. And so if you have some questions in the chat, you can go ahead and leave them now. We are going to just take a couple minutes and answer questions. I'm gonna give you a softball first off, Ronnie. Someone wants to know who, we know that your favorite Derby horse, Derby, is Mind That Bird in 2009, but who won the Derby the year you were born?
Man, I gotta admit this, huh?
It is a double-edged question for sure.
Yeah, 1971
Okay.
was a horse named Canyonero II.
Okay.
They called him the Caracas Cannonball. Even though he was bred in Kentucky, he actually was from Venezuela. He was sold early and went to Venezuela, and he may have been the longest shot to ever win, but he was involved in the field, which is a betting thing that they do. But yeah, the Caracas Cannonball, 1971, Canyonero II.
Ooh, I knew there would be a good story behind your. Okay, next question. Who chose the design for the Twin Spires, and how long did it take to create the grandstand as we know it today?
Oh my. The architect is credited with Joseph Valdez. He was a young man who later worked, it would be Luckett and Farley, who's still in today here in Louisville. But he was the designer, the architect of the Twin Spires. And by the way, for people wondering why they built the spires, ornamental reasons, you know, just decoration. Although the first radio broadcast in 1927 was done up in one of the Twin Spires. How long it took the grandstand, it's hard to say. I mean, the original grandstand, the Twin Spires, were built in 1895, and they've added on to it many, many, many times over the years. The last really big construction was in 2003, 2004. But like I said, they've been adding on to that place just about every year because the demand for Derby tickets is always there. It's a bucket list now for so many people. And the average attendance now is upwards of 165,000 people. So they did start, they are planning on building a hotel. You may have heard of that, but that is on hold right now just until we get through the pandemic and the uncertainties there.
It is true that Churchill Downs is growing kind of just like Louisville keeps growing. You know, we keep adding on to things, and so everything's on hold a little bit for now. But we will we'll just look forward to a new type of derby in the fall.
Absolutely.
It'll still be on the first Saturday of a month.
That's right. That's right.
That'll be great. The next question I have is, what is the history of the Kentucky Oaks? If you could give a little bit of history of the Kentucky Oaks and how that race has come to be such an important part of Kentucky's Derby tradition.
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, if anyone wants to really dig into that, on our website, Derby Museum website, it's derbymuseum.org. We have what's called a virtual museum. And I wrote, several of us wrote about the Oaks last week. And we really got into, you know, I did that thing on the top 5 Oaks winners, and there's some really good information there and activities. But to answer the question, the Oaks was one of the foundation races that Colonel Clark patterned his racing program after. The Oaks has not always been run on the Friday before the Derby. It's been kind of interspersed throughout the race meet as they try to figure out the best place to put it. The tradition of putting it the day before the Derby was actually in the 1940s. And they started doing it before the 1940s. And now you get over 100,000 people here on Oaks Day because so many people are coming from around the world. They want to be here more than just one day. They come in for the Derby, you know, the Thursday before the Derby. They stay for the Oaks and then stay again for the Derby before heading out of town. So the Oaks really, really grew in stature, I would say, in the last 25 years or so. And today, with the purse money the way that it is, you don't see very many fillies running in the Kentucky Derby. One part of that is because 3-year-old fillies, they want to win the Oaks. So yeah. I hope I answered that question good enough there.
I think so. I think encouraging people to go to your virtual museum is a great idea. Yeah. So that's fantastic. I love that. From our executive director, I think I know why she's asking this, is the Locust Grove Stakes still run at Churchill Downs? The Locust Grove Stakes? What?
I'll need to double check that. Yeah, there was Locust Grove Stakes. That's a really early one as well. Yeah, there was a race named after Locust Grove, and I'm sure that has to do with the Clark connection, with the two families, the Churchills and the Clarks. I don't remember what time of year it's run, but I'll double check that to you and let you know.
When I've checked the race calendar before, it moves around. So yeah. Sometimes it's in the spring meet and sometimes it's in the September meet. So we'll just have to stay tuned, just like the Derby. Another quick question. You talked a lot about this one's from Michelle Ellisberg. You talked a lot about the role of African Americans in the Kentucky Derby. Could you talk a little bit about the changing demographics? Because a lot of current jockeys and horsemen and women are of Latino descent.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, nowadays jockeys really do come from everywhere. Louisiana, a ton of our jockeys still come from Louisiana. There's a great tradition of Cajun jockeys, and so we still get a lot there. We get a lot of our jockeys nowadays are Hispanic. There's a great racing tradition in Mexico, and Peru has a wonderful tradition there as well. And of course, jockeys, they want to go to the tracks, where they can compete at the highest level. So Churchill has always attracted, you know, the top jockeys in the world, really, because we also have European jockeys that come over and compete. African American jockeys, I mentioned, were pushed out in the really up into the early 20th century, and have really never made a comeback because there's a couple of reasons. Number one, you can't discount racism as part of that as well, but also because in the 20th century, many African Americans left the countryside and moved to cities for work opportunities, and people who work with horses generally come from rural areas. And so there's also cultural reasons why you don't see too many black jockeys nowadays. The last black jockey to ride in the Derby was Kevin Krigger, and I believe that was 2013. And he rode a horse named Golden Sense, but he was the last black jockey to ride in the Derby.
Okay, thank you. Is there, this one question comes from Mary Beth Fisher, and she asks, is there still a new Louisville Jockey Club today, and what does membership look like? Breeders, corporate sponsors, qualifications? Can we join the Louisville Jockey Club?
Yeah, not really, not the way it is now. It's Churchill Downs is a corporation that hosts the Kentucky Derby, and in fact, Churchill Downs Incorporated is traded on NASDAQ. They're a large company, and they own other tracks. They own other wagering facilities. They own their own production companies. So Churchill Downs Incorporated is a large corporation. The new Louisville Jockey Club that I mentioned, they actually didn't really make a go of it either. There were several takeovers and, you know, stock takeovers and things like that I didn't get into. But yeah, the new Louisville Jockey Club didn't make it to nowadays.
Okay, I didn't know if there was like a secret entrance at Churchill Downs. We had to have a knock or something.
Secret knock, right?
I mean, it was a clubhouse still. A question from someone who's not from Kentucky. So controversial. Keeneland seems to consider themselves to be the best racetrack in Kentucky. Obviously, Churchill Downs has some of the best attendance. Is Keeneland's claim to fame more horse sales and breeding than racing? We're opening a whole can of worms.
Yeah, it's just different. It's hard to say what's best because, you know, everybody has their own ideas of what a great day at the races looks like. Keeneland, if you've not been there, is outside of Lexington a little bit, and it's more pastoral. You know, for a long time, Keeneland didn't even have a race announcer. You would watch the races, and it's only been in the last, I don't know, 15 years or so that they've even had a race in it. Maybe more than that. I'm getting old, but you know, it's just a different experience at Keeneland, and I absolutely love going to Keeneland. But it's a different experience. Churchill is quite a bit older. Keeneland, I believe, was built in the 1920s. Before that, they had another track in Lexington called the Association Racetrack, which is long gone. But it's just different, you know. Churchill Downs, it's people think when they get to Churchill a lot of times that they're going to be out in the country, but we are an urban racetrack. When they built Churchill, you know, that was a farm owned by the Churchill brothers, but the city of Louisville kept growing and growing and growing, and it's very much an urban racetrack now. So, you know, I'm partial a little bit. I don't work for Churchill Downs. I work for the Derby Museum. We're separate, but still, when I walk around Churchill Downs, especially when I'm by myself, you can just feel the history. You know, you can cut that history with a knife, it feels like, because of all of the great champions that have raced there.
There is definitely a difference between Keeneland and Churchill Downs. Definitely. There are two questions, two final questions, unless I get new ones. We understand that your fiance is a Derby Day baby. What horse did won on her birthday?
The horse that won in 1975. was a horse named Foolish Pleasure. And he, unfortunately, he won the Derby in '75. So soon after, he had Seattle Slew, Affirmed, and Spectacular Bid. So everybody forgets about Foolish Pleasure, but it was a very good horse.
I think, you know, there's some horses that if you're born on their birthday, on their day, if your birthday's Derby day, you might want to don't name your child.
Right.
All right, the final question. Ronnie, who is your favorite jockey? Currently, past jockey?
Oh, wow. Wow. My favorite jockey, my favorite living jockey is Calvin Burrell.
Oh, yeah.
I just have a special place for Calvin. But my favorite jockey of all time, it's a tragic story, actually. Citation, the 1948 Triple Crown winner, was an amazing, amazing racehorse. But his original jockey was a young man named Al Snyder. And Al Snyder was not a well-known jockey, but he got the mount on Citation. And those two started winning all of these races. And, you know, Al Snyder was a hardworking guy. He was a young man who had just recently gotten married, and they had a young daughter named Nancy. So he was so excited to go to Louisville to ride in his first Derby aboard Citation. Unfortunately, he went on a fishing trip with some friends down in the Florida Keys in March of that year. And they went out fishing, and there was a storm that blew up, and they were never seen again.
Oh, wow.
Several of them went out on a rowboat or a skiff. And for a while, for a long time, it was the largest manhunt in Florida history. But no sign was ever found of Al Snyder. Eddie Arcaro got the mount on Citation and went on to, you know, glory. But Al Snyder's, you know, I hate to end the program on a downer, but you know, he just something special about that. He just, I think, deserves to be remembered.
Absolutely. There are so many great stories and great people who definitely deserve to be remembered. And even though we want to remember Al Snyder, let's ask, I have one final question. Who's going to win the Derby on September 5th?
Who's going to win the Derby on September 5th? Well, can I just say one of Bob Baffert's horses?
Oh, there you go. My answer is always a four-legged brown horse because it feels
yeah. You know, I didn't put a slide on here with Bob Baffert. I need to with Justify and American Pharaoh, but he absolutely is loaded again with horses this year. So September 5th, you know, see who Baffert has in there, Nadal or Charlatan, one of those, and there you go.
All right, you can never really go wrong. Ronnie, thank you so much. This was such a wonderful program. Our next program is going to be a living room lecture series again on Wednesday, May 20th at 1 p.m. Terry Foodie will be talking to us about cholera and the Kentucky cholera epidemic in the 1830s. So please stay tuned for information to register for that. And now I'm going to turn it over to our Executive Director, Carol Ely, to take us out. Carol? There you are.
Hi. That was so much fun, Ronnie. Thank you. I think we could all use a little fun. I mean, now we're going to pivot to cholera. I'm sure that Terry will do just as fun a job with cholera. And I learned that I share a birthday with the Kentucky Derby, May 17th. So there we go.
Yeah.
And the year that I was born, the Derby winner was Needles. Yeah. So I'm really glad my parents were not inspired by that to give me a Derby-inspired name. Anyway, thank you all very much for coming. We really appreciate you joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Appreciate you. Thank you.
All right, everyone. Thanks so much for being with us. And we will see you back here again on May 20th at 1 p.m. for Terry Foodie. And you can sign up for the Locust Grove email list on our website. I also will send out that link to today's lecture so you can rewatch or if you missed part of it. And we will send out registration information for our next lecture. We're so pleased you're with us today. Ronnie, once again, thank you so much, and Stay well, everyone. Happy Derby.
Thank you.
Bye, all.